All right, folks, let's go ahead and get started. For those who don't know me, my name is Michel Salem. I'm the Associate Director of CDRL on behalf of the Center. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our seminar today. Is the world still in a democratic recession? I don't know about you all, but I've been really looking forward to this one for a long time. As a matter of fact, last night, I kept waking up before my alarm. Every half hour, I kept waking up, looking at the watch. Is it time to get up to come to the seminar? And ultimately, at the very end, to quote the great words of our speaker today, Larry Diamond, I got 3 hours of sleep. Thank you so much for joining us. Larry Diamond, you all know him, and he knows each one of you, and he doesn't need an introduction, but he certainly deserves one. His official bio will tell you that he is the William Clayton Senior Fellow at Hoover, and the Most Bacher Senior Fellow at FSI, Professor by courtesy in Political Science and Sociology at Stanford, former Director of CDRL for 6 years, I believe. 6 years? 8 years?
6.5.
6.5. Oh, that's not a lot. I mean, in the Middle East, leaders usually stay for much longer. But he also the leader of multiple programs, including the program that I run with him, the program in Arab Reform and Democracy here at CDRL, and also at the Hoover Institution, China's Global Sharp Power Program, Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region at Hoover Program, the co-leader of the Global Digital Policy Incubator at FSI's Cyber Policy Center. But this does not, all of these titles do not even begin to scratch the surface of who Larry Diamond is and the stature that he has garnered as a scholar, as a global thinker, and a Stanford leader. So let me tell it as it is. Larry Diamond is the undisputed founding father of democracy studies. He has shaped and nurtured this field with his research, his leadership, and the global community that he has built around the goal of studying and advancing democratic change. He co-founded the Journal of Democracy and brought the research and intellectual innovations of our field to the desks and bookshelves of policymakers, of activists, of aspiring change makers. His work has been at the forefront of the study of democracy and democratization for over 4 decades, and his numerous books and articles have left their mark on nearly every syllabus dealing with questions of political change. They have also shaped graduate and undergraduate training in our field in profound ways. His work has always shown a deep concern for the health of democracy, be it here in the US or around the world, as was the case in his books, The Spirit of Democracy, The Shadow of Democracy, and Ill Winds, which you all know. His work has never forgotten about the underdogs and the marginalized voices who are struggling to advance democratic change under authoritarian regimes or in the face of external autocratic influences, which are many of them in this day and age. Larry Diamond, as you all know, is never afraid to speak his truth and never afraid to speak truth to power, even if it makes some friends uncomfortable. And if you don't believe me, pick up and read Squandered Victory. And his contributions as a leader and educator at Stanford are too many for me to list. But for the sake of brevity, let me just say that I can probably name an entire army of change makers who are leading their fields, whether in academia, in policy, in civil society, in international organizations, individuals from diverse backgrounds from across the ideological spectrum, and they have one thing in common. They are former students and mentees of Larry Diamond. Larry, we are honored to have you with us. We're honored to be your colleagues. Please join me in welcoming Larry.
So it's nice to be introduced by a former student, and to be introduced without the alliterations. I'm glad you had your mouth full when
Hey,
I
those
said
are
that.
great. A lot of people love those.
But let me say, Catherine, those are nice too. So thank you very much. Actually, one of my former students is Steve Levitsky, who's just written a piece with Luke and Way in the Journal of Democracy. I think a very intelligent and important piece that puts the emphasis on the resilience of democracy during this last kind of latter period of the third wave of democracy in the world. So what I want to do today is mainly diagnostic, just try and get some sense of how to think about the world today in terms of the balance between democratic recession and democratic resilience, and think about it regionally, think about it empirically, and think about it normatively in terms of what we know about how people are perceiving democracy and what they think and value about democracy. I'm going to have just, I'm warning you, a lot of slides. They're very, very data intensive slides. I'll be glad to share them with you if you want them, but there's no way I can do this lecture without going through them very quickly. So bear with me. My summary observations are that I do think the world is and has been in a democratic recession, and it's been a prolonged one since about 2007. You know, this is in some ways a glass part full, glass part empty story, and I'll let you decide whether it's half and half, 60-40, you know, you can characterize it as you wish. There are multiple trends going on, but what I would argue is what this period has not been is simply a plateauing or a leveling off of the democratic progress that the world experienced in the 1980s, the explosive growth of democracy and freedom in the late 80s and early 90s, the continuation of that up until about 2006. Since then, there's been in aggregate terms a modest, on average, retreat of freedom and democracy in the world. But if you disaggregate it into countries and narratives, and this is where I think the story becomes more subtle and must get beyond just aggregate numbers, the situation is more concerning. So yes, there have been stories of democratic resilience that I think are quite remarkable when you consider what a lot of these countries are facing. But what worries me is the still slow grinding stagnation and deterioration of democracy in a lot of really important countries, and the very contested nature of where we're at now. And the strongest summary statement I could make is that I think we remain in a very volatile and uncertain period in which democracy could rebound in a lot of places, and there have been stories of rebound fairly recently from populism and illiberal dissent, certainly in Brazil with Bolsonaro's defeat. And most dramatically, I think it's one of the most important positive things that's happened to democracy since the democratic recession began in 2007, the defeat of the Law and Justice Party, which is an illiberal populist and probably best characterized as the soft authoritarian party in Poland. And then this leaves us with the eternal question of the last 15 years, is democratic consolidation still a useful concept? I don't have time to wade into that conceptual and theoretical debate, but I'm happy to address it in Q&A. These, I think, remain the key empirical trends. Number one, as I will show you, global levels of freedom and democracy have declined. We don't have consensus on how to measure democracy or even how to characterize it in dichotomous terms, yes and no. I'll address more about that. Increasingly, what I have converged on doing is to take a poll of polls, to take the three principal annual ratings of levels of democracy in the world by Freedom House, the Economist Intelligence Unit, and the Varieties of Democracy Project, and standardize and average those. And I'm going to show you some results of that. Underlying that is a deteriorating rule of law and declines in accountability of all kinds, but significantly in horizontal accountability. And this will also involve, on my part, some interpretation of why we're seeing what we're seeing and what the kind of institutional parameters of it have been. Illiberal populism, it's not invincible. It can be defeated or reversed or rolled back. And I think we'll see that now happening if the opposition succeeds in forming a democratic government in Poland, which I think they're going to do. But it's still quite tenacious. We've got my co-editor of our new forthcoming book on the troubling state of India's democracy, Dinsha Mistry here, and I'm going to say in more detail why I think the decline of democracy in India, obviously the largest democracy in the world, is really one of the most important reasons why we should not glibly celebrate the resilience of democracy in the world. The fourth trend, which I don't have time to talk about, but which is serving and feeding the illiberal populist trend and also being advanced by it, is the growing polarization of public opinion, political alignments, and political emotions, emotional attachments in the world, and this being magnified by social media. I think one of the bottom lines of what I have to say here, and in particular, what I had to say recently to Forum 2000 in Prague earlier this month, and what I will have to say when I give the Seymour Martin Lipset lecture to the National Endowment for Democracy on December 6th, is that global power really matters. And this is an extremely important and I think underappreciated or under-remembered theme of Samuel Huntington's book on the third wave. And we've had, let's face it, a massive shift in global power that has had significant, could have been worse so far, but it's been a significant impact on the kind of normative dynamics around democracy in the world and the ability of the democracies to push back. And that relates to the decay of democracy in the US and parts of Europe. I'll try to say a few words about that. But I can utter one sentence and you can leave after this. The most important determinant of the future of democracy are going to be two elections in 2024, one in India and the other in the United States. I'm going to review a lot of public opinion data from different regions of the world, particularly Latin America and Africa, and that presents a mixed picture. And again, the country-specific picture has elements of concern that I think can be masked by the regional averages, but in Latin America, the regional averages are not good. And then I'll talk about what's happened in transitions to democracy, but that was in the article that I guess you discussed the other day. So let me begin by saying this. I'm not going to issue a long disquisition here on the definition of democracy, but I think this is just my own perspective. I long since gave up the search for consensus on a definition of democracy. So all we can do is be transparent about how we're measuring, how we're conceiving this, and then proceed from there. I have a database that runs from 1974 through the end of 22, and it's got 3 scores: electoral democracy, liberal democracy, non-democracy. Liberal democracy, it's not perfect, but my rough and ready is just all the countries that get one of the 2 best scores, a 1 or a 2 on the aggregate 7-point scale of Freedom House of political rights and civil liberties. It's got to be one of the 2 best scores on both. The designation free, which can be a 2 and a 3, I think is too lax a term for liberal democracy, but too strict a term for electoral democracy. There are illiberal democracies in the world that do worse than a 2 and a 3 on the Freedom House scale, but have the minimum standard that's necessary, in my view, for a country to be an electoral democracy, and that is that they allow free and fair competition for power. I don't have the time here to spell out all the dimensions of that. I do it in several pages of The Spirit of Democracy, and no one, to my mind, has ever done it better than the Danish scholars Elklet and Svensson did in an article in the Journal of Democracy, I don't know, probably 20 years ago now, on what constitutes free and fair elections. But the key point is this: there's got to be a level playing field. And if you don't have, it's never perfect. I mean, maybe it's close to perfect in Norway or something. It's far from perfect in the United States, but I'm still willing to call the United States today an electoral democracy. But I think the continuing tendency, sadly, of Freedom House, among others, to call Hungary an electoral democracy when the landscape for political competition has been so massively distorted and tilted toward the ruling party is simply, to my mind, a breathtaking failure of analytic rigor. And I don't care how much of course I care, but for the classification of whether the country is an electoral democracy or not, I don't care that Orban is not literally throwing people in jail. If the opposition cannot get its story out because the media has been virtually completely taken over by Orban, if he controls the electoral administration, the electoral districting, and has managed to terrorize businesses in a way that has virtually starved opposition parties of funding, I mean, you get to a point where you just can't call that electoral democracy. So this is where we stood at the end of 2022. This is not a trend line, it's a snapshot. And it's based on my assessment of which countries are electoral democracies by the standard I articulated, and then the liberal democracy standard I spoke of. And, you know, this is the Western European and Anglophone countries, the small Pacific Island states. They're all still electoral democracies. Most for now liberal democracies. Central and Eastern Europe, not Hungary. Latin American and Caribbean countries that have more than 1 million population. Asia, East, Southeast, and South. Sub-Saharan Africa, former Soviet Union, and Middle East and North Africa. So you can look at the numbers, that's the snapshot. More interesting is what's happened between 2006 and 2022, and now is the beginning of, is the glass 60% full, 75% full, 50% full? You decide. The numbers aggregate actually don't look that bad. In Central and Eastern Europe, there's been some slippage in the percentage of states that meet a test of electoral democracy. In Latin America and the Caribbean, you know, no longer El Salvador, Nicaragua, there's been very serious slippage throughout throughout Central America, a little bit less so in South America. The story is more subtle in Latin America, actually, and I'm going to come to it. This is a decline from 40% of all Asian countries to 32%, and you can see the numbers. The biggest decline, unarguably, in my view, in the extent of democracy on a regional basis is in Sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm not even yet downgrading Sierra Leone after the very bad election it had, but I think that the ratings agencies will be forced to do that at the end of this year. And, you know, it makes sense. Where is the erosion likely to be greatest, the loss of democracy likely to be greatest? We can hypothesize from our social science theories, and to a considerable extent correctly, that it's going to be in two types of countries. In countries that have relatively low levels of economic development, and in countries that have and weak institutions associated with it, and I'll be coming back to that, and in countries where democracy was least liberal to start with. I made this argument about 25 years ago in a book I wrote called Developing Democracy, that there's a very strong relationship between the depth of democracy, the liberal extent of democracy, and the stability or persistence of democracy. And indeed, if you look at which democracies have been failing, disappearing, slipping, either having coups, executive or military now, all over again, we have to say military, or having executive desecrations of democratic practice that eventually drive the country beneath the minimum standards of democracy, they've mainly been happening in countries that were not liberal democracies to start with. It's not like you never get the disappearance of democracy in a country that had been a liberal democracy, witness Hungary, but it's a much rarer phenomenon. Anyway, these are the trends between 2006 and 22, regionally for electoral democracy and then for liberal democracy. Now, if you just say, okay, what's been the trend in the percentage of states that are democracies, the top line, the blue line, or the percentage of states that, which is, you know, obviously smaller, that are liberal democracies, it's not so bad. It's peaked around 2006 at about 62, 63% by my judgment. It's now down to about 53% now. This is, I'd say, a sign of a democratic recession, but, you know, a mild one. There's obviously a lot of resilience in that. If you say, let's take out the roughly 45 states that have populations less than 1 million, which are overwhelmingly much more likely to be democratic and to be liberal democracies, and just look at the other states, and if you make the coding decision, which I agonize about and I go back and forth about, but I have made for these slides that you're going to see, that you will follow the Freedom House assessment that Indonesia no longer meets the minimum requirements of electoral democracy, and you will follow the mounting evidence, which we agonized over in our India project, that Narendra Modi has now driven the political landscape in India and the climate for political opposition and dissent below the level of the minimum conditions for electoral democracy, which I'm not entirely comfortable with, because I think India is the truly classic gray zone country where you could argue it either way. But if you do, it's now the percentage of states with populations over 1 million that are electoral democracies has fallen to 43%. And that's a big drop from 57 to 43%. And by the way, if you move those two countries into the other column, you know, it's still well below 50% now. And you see a more modest decline in the percentage of states that are liberal democracies. But this is the obvious and really shocking slide, that if you stipulate that these two countries of India and Indonesia can really no longer be called electoral democracies, which again is a disputable proposition, but a defensible one, then the percentage of people in the world living in electoral democracy has fallen from the peak of about 54% to 25%. And that is a shocking number. And the fact that we're even arguing about how to classify India is, to my mind, one of the most sobering dimensions of the world we're in. I'm going to share some slides now that I shared with Catherine's class last week that I think portray this a little bit better. And since we're looking at the aggregate picture, it's not that dependent on one or two coding decisions. We can take the entire population of regimes in each kind of period. And I have to start in order to wind up with a 10-year period at the end here with a 9-year period at the beginning of the third wave, and just ask what percentage of the democracies that existed in that decade broke down. And as the third wave was just getting started, you know, it was pretty high. It was 1 in 6. And then it declined to 8% in each of the next 2 decades. And as you can see, the rate of democratic breakdown has been rising. And it was 12% in the early 2000s, and nearly 1 in 5 of all democracies that existed in the last decade that ended at the end of last year broke down. And we have a declining rate of democratic transition. It's just the same thing in reverse. What percentage of the autocracies that existed in each decade broke down? And the answer is that we had the miracle period of the late 1980s and early 90s, where 36% of all the autocracies that existed in that period not only broke down, but broke down and gave way to electoral democracy. And that rate through the rest of the 90s and early 2000s remained pretty good, another 30%. But you can see it's been declining and fell to 12% most recently. And if you take that balance for the last 10 years, we've entered a period of net decrease by 10% in the overall level of democracies, and you break it down, the ratio of democratic transitions to democratic breakdowns, and it's really gotten dramatically worse in the last 5 years. Only 30% as many transitions as breakdowns. Now, another very familiar slide is this ratio of countries that have been gaining by at least 1 point and their 100-point freedom scores on the Freedom House scale between 1991 and the present, the ratio of gainers to decliners. And the story was really good between the end of the Cold War in 1991 and 2005. The ratio was almost always positive. Sometimes it was 2.5 times as many countries gaining as declining. But you can see that kind of reversed in a mirror image until last year, when it came up almost to equilibrium again, leading Freedom House to ask, well, maybe the democratic recession is coming to an end, except the rest of what I'm going to show you, I think, hardly justifies that conclusion. Average levels of freedom in the world continuing to decline, a certain, noticeable amount by about 10% overall on the Freedom House scale, 8% less on the Economist scale, less still on the VDEM scale. I'm showing you everything, what supports my argument and what kind of doesn't seem to be all that consistent with it. So if you pick out, some key countries on the Freedom House scale, you find that one of the countries that has declined the most in percentage terms is the US, which you can see here. But here is India, here is Hungary, here is the Philippines. We've got some countries making, pretty significant declines. I'm going to show you some others a bit later. We can, some of you have seen versions of these slides over the years. We can decompose the Freedom House scales of political rights and civil liberties from 2 scales into 3, and break out the ones that deal with transparency and the rule of law, as I've done, and then standardized it on a 0 to 1 scale. And the critical point is it doesn't matter which region you look at. Transparency and the rule of law lags well behind the other 2 scales of political rights and civil liberties. It is the lagging scale. it is, I think, a major reason why we're in a democratic recession and why democracy itself is sliding backwards in a number of different countries. This is Central and Eastern Europe. I'd say kind of a modest decline in the transparency front, modest decline in the other two scales, but a huge gap between these dimensions. And this is Sub-Saharan Africa, where everything is declining, but the rule of law is losing the most ground. Again, this doesn't look like a big democratic recession. It's over the period 2006 to 22, modest erosion in the scales on average in each region. But what I want to do is zero in on some particular countries. You can see the countries, no surprise to Aisha here at the bottom, in terms of the countries that have lost the most ground on the Freedom House scale. Sadly, the US is in the middle of this. I don't have the time to belabor this point, but one of the reasons why I think we have to call this still a period of democratic recession is that there just have not been any big, stunning, successful breakthroughs to democracy in recent years. And a lot of the big opportunities that emerged, not only virtually all of them in the Arab Spring, and then Tunisia became a democracy, and now it suffered a breakdown of democracy. And in terms of its geostrategic importance, I think the failure of democracy in Tunisia, the only Arab democracy, has been one of the most important developments in the last 20 years or so. But, you know, Guaido became the, recognized president of Venezuela in 2019 after the elections, and there were mass demonstrations, and they failed to bring about a transition to democracy. Mugabe dies, and there's popular mobilization, but it fails to deliver in Zimbabwe, and the opposition has just been defeated again in the election there. The Green Movement in Iran, the transition to Burma, which imploded with a military coup. I could go on and on. But the point is, these were all openings. These were all plausible moments when in a previous era, democratic transitions were happening in circumstances like these. And none of these have either borne democratic fruit, maybe they still will in a place like Sudan, and others kind of briefly were looking hopeful and then failed. So let's look at some individual countries now. This is one of the most alarming. You can see here that the VDEM has scales of electoral democracy here and liberal democracy here, I think has a much more frank and sensitive recognition of the breathtaking deterioration of political pluralism in Hungary than the other two scales have. Here is Turkey, again, no surprise. But one of the things to be said is that the dissent has been continuing, and the protests, the mobilization, the very broad electoral front, all of this has failed to dislodge, I think, a increasingly manifestly unsuccessful in terms of its economic performance authoritarian regime. Here is Brazil. Now, of course, this is the end of 2022. At the end of 2022, Lula da Silva defeats Bolsonaro. Brazil is something of a comeback story. But keep in mind the margin that Lula won by, it wasn't big. It was less than, I don't know, 1.5 points or something like that. Bolsonaro is disqualified from running again for the presidency as a result of his crimes against democracy. It'd be nice if we had a similar provision that could be enforced in the United States. But his son is gaining political popularity. I'd say Brazil is an ongoing drama. This is Indonesia. It's going to have a presidential election. Don Emerson could tell us more about what it might mean, but one of the leading candidates, maybe the leading candidate to be president of Indonesia is the former son-in-law of General Suharto, who's got a lot of blood on his hands from human rights violations in Aceh. Anyway, you can see this is, again, VDEM has been way ahead of the curve in terms of Freedom House and EIU by comparison in documenting the democratic deterioration of India under the BJP government over the last 9 years. The Philippines maybe coming back a little bit, ironically, under Marcos Jr. And then some, stories of amazing resilience and democratic vigor in Taiwan, Korea. We could find others. I'm just showing you China by comparison. Now, there's another way of getting at this, and it's a way that I think gives us a little bit more traction and maybe methodological confidence, which is to take, again, the average of the three scales, Freedom House, the Economist Intelligence Unit, and the varieties of democracy, liberal democracy scale, and say, what have been the trends? This is a snapshot over the 16 years of what I think has been a democratic recession from 2006 through the current point, but we're looking at end of 2022. And what you see is what I think we need to appreciate. Very divergent stories. I could show you many more Latin American countries, and you would see the divergence. But Argentina so far has shown very considerable resilience, as you'll see in a few minutes, erosion in support for democracy, but even a lot of resilience in support for democracy, which is pretty amazing when you consider that they've got an inflation rate of about 140%. Poverty rate that I've seen is up to over 40%. And they've got a dysfunctional party system and are about to elect what many people consider to be a lunatic as president of the country. But who knows? Maybe Javier Milei will break the back of inflation and revindicate Milton Friedman in Latin America all over again. He's certainly the only politician in the world I know of who has a clone Mastiff dog named Milton Friedman. Brazil, when we get these numbers for the end of 2023, we'll probably see Brazil rebounding. The country, a lot of people actually are talking about the decline of democracy in India. The country that astonishingly very few Americans are talking about in terms of dramatic, serious, alarming deterioration of democracy is our neighbor to the south, Mexico. And actually, if you look at any of these measures, and I'm going to show you a little bit of public opinion as well, there has been very, very significant institutional erosion of democracy in Mexico under one of the really prominent, though kind of hard to characterize, illiberal populist leaders of our time, AMLO, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. Now, I'm not going to get to everything I have to say, so let me say that one reason why it hasn't gotten worse is the same reason why it kind of had illiberal authoritarian populism, arrested development, or faced a certain wall of resistance in Poland. And that was, in Poland, there was a very strong civil society. Maybe it's a little weaker in Mexico, but when you've got constitutional structures that prevent the concentration of power and constitutional courts and parameters that can constrain this, and unlike in Hungary, the authoritarian party and ruler does not have the special majority in parliament to amend the Constitution. It's an extremely important variable that seems to separate the countries that fall beneath the threshold of democracy and cease to be electoral democracies from the ones that merely suffer democratic battering. Here are 5 countries in Asia. You can see by these average measures a documentation of pretty significant democratic decline between 2014, which was of course the year that Modi came to power, and the end of last year, by this average scale of the 3 measures, and a pattern of decline in Indonesia as well, decline in the Philippines. Well, Bangladesh ceased to be even an electoral democracy a long time ago. And I'll just say, I thought Thailand was going to turn the corner this year with the remarkable elections that they had, which would have been another instance, I think, of reversing authoritarian trajectory through party coalition, civic mobilization, and the extraordinary mobilization of young urban voters around democratic themes, with some interesting similarities between what happened in Thailand and what happened just recently in Poland. But the military pulled a rabbit out of a hat. I would probably be arrested in Thailand if I said this, but probably with the assistance of the monarchy, and kept the Democratic coalition from coming to power. And now you have another cynical, non-democratic bargain. Here's some post-communist countries with Turkey thrown in because I didn't know where else to put it. But you can see democratic resilience in the Czech Republic, democratic decline in Hungary, decline but not as sharp in Poland, and probably some reversal. And these are the objective ratings, and it's not a happy story for Ukraine. But how democratic and liberal can a country be when it's under attack? Okay, why is this happening? I think that we come back to our classic kind of debate and duality between norms and institutions, and of course the intimate interaction between them. I think we have to allow for the fact that elites in many of these countries have probably long had shallow, contingent, opportunistic commitments to democracy. They were constrained by the realities. There wasn't much space or running room to do what many ruling elites would probably always prefer to do, which is to concentrate and abuse power and barricade themselves in it. But norms have been eroding, if not aspirations for democracy, certainly willingness to support it, by declining democratic performance, both on political grounds in terms of maintaining order, fighting corruption, which is a hugely influential factor here, and economic performance. I think we've abandoned civic education, not only in the United States, but in many other parts of the world. We kind of checked that box, took it for granted, and now we're not doing it, and young people are growing up in a cesspool of social media and authoritarian disinformation. Then there's been the decline of accountability, and one dimension of this, the kind of individual accountability of internal normative checks. People aren't going to go down that road because they actually believe in democratic restraint. That's been eroding. I actually think, watching what's been happening in Africa, that we've been getting the president of Ghana today, same party as the founding president in 2000, is just a very different kind of person. And so I think there's a little bit of that. Compare Argentina at the founding with Argentina today. So there's a little bit of difference in recruitment, but there's also a different environment. the agencies of horizontal accountability have been declining for some time in some places. In a lot of countries, the constitutional constraints that protect them are weak and open to appropriation. Societal accountability, the concept from Smulevitz and Perazzotti in a Journal of Democracy article, but you can infer what that is. That's kind of eroded. The biggest change, in my view, has been the erosion of external accountability, of knowledge on the part of democratic actors in these countries that they would pay a steep international price for violating democratic norms and constitutional rules. And then we've had very significant institutional decay, and in some cases just institutional weakness from the start, but it becomes more salient over time. The political party system in a number of these countries, none more so than in Peru, is in absolute total meltdown chaos. Legislatures often have bent on wounded knee to overbearing executives, or at least the loyal party members in the legislature to the illiberal populist leader. Where the trend toward illiberal populism has been arrested, almost everywhere, you're going to love to hear this, the courts have played an enormously important role. And where the project has not been able to be stopped, it's because the illiberal populist was able to stack the court, amend the rules for supporting Supreme Court justices. Israelis know this, and that's why the battle over the Supreme Court has rightly been viewed in Israel as a battle to preserve liberal democracy, maybe democracy itself, who knows. And then, all the other institutions of civil society and the state, if they're weak, if they're captured, if they are defenseless, or if you get an illiberal populist who understands the 12-step program for conquering authoritarian power and can gradually go to work on intimidating these, robbing them of resources, robbing them of freedom, robbing them of independent ownership or control, you just get this steady incremental decline. Poor performance across the board has been a major factor here. And I think that if you look at the literature on the links to legitimacy, the political dimensions of performance in terms of maintaining order, containing crime and violence and insecurity, and controlling corruption are at least as important as the economic dimensions of performance. And look, Bukele won in El Salvador because of this. He's now far and away, it's not even close, the most popular leader in Latin America. And there's no country in Latin America, I hope I can get to this data, who is more highly rated as a democratic leader than Bukele, even though he's become by now clearly an authoritarian ruler. And this is the old story. Bob Putnam documented this a long time ago. You can glean it from Frank's work. I've tried to elucidate it, that there's a vicious circle of poor performance. The state performs poorly, people withdraw trust from the state, then you get a draining away of legitimacy and compliance, including just people paying taxes. Then crime and corruption increase. The state's capacity, this is a big story of Latin America today, flourish, and you get the criminal gangs. Elites withdraw from politics because who wants to have to fight to, be a politician in this circumstance, and when it really gets going, you're risking your life anyway. And this is a formula for the thriving of populism. and the deterioration of what's called club goods and private goods, but certainly not private goods, public goods. If the state can't deliver public goods and improve infrastructure and education and healthcare in people's lives, people become even more cynical and detached. And then we're living in a world, I'm not going to go over this now, you know it, where authoritarian models are diffusing. I will just summarize this dimension by saying that next year is going to be an extremely critical year for the future of democracy. And anyone who thinks they have a confident answer to recession or resilience, even me, I suggest let's wait until the end of next year and we see how some of these critical elections fly. We may have a more hopeful story at the end or a more alarming end. But if the two most largest democracies in the world both witness victories for clearly authoritarian projects, that is going to be very frightening for the future of democracy in those countries and globally. And let me say, I'm just recently back from South Africa, and I think that South Africa is in a very, very deep state of democratic crisis. So a few things about public opinion here. If you look at the trends in public support for democracy, is democracy always the best form of government? You know, it's not collapsed, but on average in Latin America, we've had these peaks where over 60%, even well over 60%, said democracy is always preferable. It's now down to 48%. And the big gainer is not so much, authoritarianism, it's just apathy. I don't care anymore. And if you look at individual countries, we know it's been the story for a long time that Uruguay ranks best. It's pretty astonishing that Argentina is doing so well when you look at the state of its economy. This is 2023 data from the Latino Barometer earlier this year. Chile, we would have guessed. Obviously, this is opposition aspiration for democracy in Venezuela. Peru is a little bit surprising, but you know, look at Mexico. Right now, 35% of the public in Mexico say that democracy is always the best form of government. And there's a very strong relationship between people's self-described economic situation, whether it's very bad, bad, just okay, good, or very good, and their support for democracy. If they think their economic circumstances are good, they're much more likely to support democracy. And you might be deluded into saying this is very promising. Look at these numbers here, but this is dissatisfaction with the way democracy is working. And satisfaction with the way democracy is working in Latin America peaked around 45% during the commodities boom about 14 years ago, and it's now down to around 28% overall. And it's really low in a lot of countries like Peru, Colombia, Bolivia, even Chile and Brazil, you know, it's only at about 30%. You know, where's the one country where people are overwhelmingly satisfied with the way democracy is working in their country? The country that now has a civilian autocrat who's been brutalizing the rule of law, Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. Anyway, I'm going to skip the Asian barometer findings because they're a little bit old and haven't been updated. I'll close with Africa and say why I think we're ignoring some very important things that are happening. There's a lot of good news out of the last round, which was just completed in the last two post-COVID years out of the Afrobarometer and Sub-Saharan Africa, and there are currents of worrisome news. The good news is that support for democracy overall in Sub-Saharan Africa, on average in about 30 countries, has been holding pretty strong at about 66%. And if you look, and then the beginnings of the worrisome news are, look what's happened in South Africa, where even back round 7 was, I don't know, around 2017, even then it wasn't great at 53%, and it's now down to 43%. A similar thing on support for multi-party competition, and again, pretty strong overall for Africa on parliamentary oversight and some of the others. But when you ask people, so what do you think is really going on in your country? We assume that Botswana, Ghana, Mauritius, these are liberal democracies, they're doing well. At least we've got some great success stories in Africa. And that's not really what the people think. We're now down to about 50% in Botswana who think their country is a democracy or a democracy only with minor problems. You can see the descent in Ghana, where the ruling party is going to be booted out next December because of its corruption, and maybe that will bring things back. This is a small country, okay, over 1 million, but not Mauritius, but not overwhelmingly over 1 million. But I consider Mauritius to be a real canary in the coal mine because it was such a liberal democracy. And the rulers there now can smell the freedom to rule as ugly as they want to in the current international climate. And so, they're importing Chinese surveillance technology, they're cracking down on opposition. And in South Africa, look at the decline here from 46% to 33%. Next May, South Africa is going to have elections. And the party and the politician that's going to gain the most in those elections, most experts predict, is going to be a political party whose ruler, Julius Malema, the economic freedom fighters, has issued such pearls of democratic tolerance as, we're not talking about killing white settlers, ... yet. So I think we're really in a very alarming period. And if you look at the countries that have had coups in Sub-Saharan Africa, I'll leave you with this slide. You'll see again that these sorts of declines in public faith can have consequences.
Thank you very much, Larry. Future is so bright, to state it mildly. So today I have a quick announcement to make. We don't have a lot of time. This is a big group, so today is not the day for 2 comments and a question. Today is the day for 1 question. So let's, if you're okay with it, Larry, maybe we'll take 3 questions at a time. And why don't we group them? I'll keep a list, and we'll try to get as much engagement from people as possible. So please keep your questions concise. All right, I'm gonna start with Brett right here, and then Amakai, and then Aisha.
Great, Larry, thanks so much. I obviously really enjoyed the presentation. So whenever you begin, I think this was on the opening slide, I'll be very, very quick. You said that democracy globally could sharply gain or contract. Nothing about the subsequent number of minutes made me think that a sharp gain was at all likely. You mentioned, I think you underscored in particular, external accountability, and in particular kind of its decline, which I totally agree. So I'm just kind of curious, what in your estimation would cause sort of a sudden positive shock in external accountability? It seems to me that best case scenario is sort of stagnation in terms of external accountability for the foreseeable future, or perhaps given 2024 could turn out very, very badly for the world, in which case one would expect sort of a negative shock. So I would sort of love to know more about sort of how you think of sort of potential positive shocks.
Okay.
What are the 3 things that we should be thinking about to improve democratic resilience and output legitimacy?
Amazing, concise question.
Mine is, more concise. So I'm kind of surprised that you mentioned the decay of universities in your institutional decay part. list. Can you talk a little bit about that? You know, on the one hand, it's really surprising that universities, part of you're thinking about like how institutional decay happens, but also like, giving the conversations to date in the States about universities and their role in democracy. I think it's interesting.
Okay, so I'll try and be almost as concise in answering. I don't, I'm a long-term optimist by nature. I always will be, but in the short term, it's hard to summon a conviction that there are strong odds or grounds for near-term optimism. But I can paint you a scenario. It would start with the collapse of Russia's offensive in Ukraine and Ukraine's reunification of its territory and a complete discrediting of Putin and what he's done, maybe his fall from power. Catherine could comment on whether she thinks that would lead to even worse circumstances in Russia, but I think if we're in a global power game where all sorts of actors, this is part of my lecture for December, are making strategic calculations and bandwagoning on the basis of who they see rising and falling in the world system. Frankly, the fall of authoritarian, hard and sharp power would be a very significant element of a positive scenario. I think China is in very big trouble right now, domestically, economically. And I don't think there's any near-term prospect for the demise of Chinese communist rule, though I do think people are making as big an error as they did with the Soviet Union in 1980 or 85 to assume that it's unimaginable at any time in the next quarter century. But something that would cause China to pull back because of its deepening economic crisis would be another thing. And I'll just say it, more defeats for authoritarian projects in high-profile countries. We're nonpartisan institutions, so I'm just gonna make a general statement. If the United States election next year does not result in the election of someone who's got an agenda for the authoritarian assault on checks and balances and civil liberties, that will be a positive development. Extrapolate from that as you wish, Isham. And ditto for India. Let's say Modi is reelected, but with a much smaller majority and much recovery of kind of the democratic opposition. Let's say there's a success story in Poland from this new government, and let's say that as we walk out in the next few years, Alternative for Germany does not keep gaining electoral ground in Germany, which it's been doing recently, and Marine Le Pen does not become the next president of France, which it's looking like she might, and that we get some other surprising corrections in places we can't anticipate. I didn't get to show you, but there's been a dramatic recovery in public confidence about democracy in Zambia because of electoral alternation and movement toward a better president and defeat of autocratic forces. The autocrat died of COVID in Tanzania after denying that it existed, and a woman became president who's probably not a Democrat but much more tolerant, and the data reflect that. So I mean, you could pull that together into a best case scenario. The three things to produce democratic resilience. Well, I'm not good at counting, so I'll just say, number one, the resilience, defense, and strengthening of the judiciary. I can't emphasize enough how important this is. preventing the undermining within the EU, having the EU put its foot down and say no more in any of these cases. If you move against the Constitutional Court and the independent judiciary, you're going to lose your EU funding, which is what they should have said to Hungary in the very beginning. And there've got to be consequences for other countries in the world. Secondly, the kind of resurgence and unification of democratic forces in both politics and civil society. We know what works, what worked in Greece, what nearly worked in Turkey, what worked in Poland, what worked in the Czech Republic, to roll back illiberal and authoritarian populist projects. And, you know, step number one, it's not rocket science, is you've got to unite the opposition and the democratic forces in society, because the autocrats often in these circumstances have a lot of support. And if you don't unite and you allow yourselves to be divided and so on, then you enable them to win. And then I'll just say the third thing is we need more external pressure. And here, I think the Biden administration, you know, has really failed in its democracy agenda. They have little to show for it operationally, other than an annual summit. And the symbolism has been largely contradictory of the symbolism of the summit, as evidenced in the lionizing of Modi during his visit to Washington. I won't even get into the Saudi Arabia trip, but people saw that as purely strategic and maybe didn't expect much. So when I'm talking about universities, Aisha, I have in mind most of all what's happening in India, where Modi has really launched an assault on the independence of universities and academics, and I think has really severely damaged their independence and pluralism. But this has been going, I mean, some people think it's going on in the state of Florida. And it's certainly happening in other places. European University Institute, what was the Soros?
Central European University.
European University, and had to leave Budapest because of Orban's pressure. So that's mainly what I had in mind, is the gradual intimidation and financial and political pressure. And I predict that if it should happen, that an authoritarian personality with maybe some experience in the role gets elected president of the United States next year, there is going to be a war on universities and their autonomy, and a weaponization of federal funding of universities.
All right, let's take one round, and this will likely be, unfortunately, our final round, and we won't get to all the questions you have. If it's any consolation, if we're not getting your questions, I'm not asking my questions myself. So, Hans, all you.
Yes, thank you so much. This was really, really interesting. So I have a question about how we think about resilience. So you showed like a lot of, you know, like countries that kind of like remain stable over time, you know, these measures that you use, and you call that resilience. But I was wondering, I think the same for some of the kind of like survey data that you use. But I'm wondering if this doesn't like maybe conflate two different things. On the one hand, being like, you know, strong, stable, resilient institutions that can protect the country from kind of like anti-democratic like movements or attacks, and on the other hand, just having countries where just nobody's really trying to chip away democratic freedoms. So I guess like I'm wondering, so I think we should also kind of like measure the existence of credible threats to democracy, irrespective of whether they actually lead to a decline in democracy course.
Andreas and then Tom.
Thank you so much. One really quick question about faith in democracy.
About what?
Faith in democracy.
Oh,
Sorry. I've been doing some work on erosion in Mexico, and one thing that we see pretty consistently is that AMLO sort of cloaks his political project in this sort of, you know, this is a democratic revolution. This is a democratic deepening, is what he's doing. we're pushing back against the authoritarian past, we're pushing back against corrupt special interests. And so I think that's a fairly common strategy among populists. So I wonder, to what extent, how do we think about public opinion data in light of that? How do people understand what democracy is when you ask them how much they value it?
Tom?
Really two quick questions. One is, you mentioned that in Poland, the strength was in civil society. I'm curious to know if there are any really reliable scales that measure the strength of civil society and that could be looked at in comparison to the three scales that you were citing. In the second question is, you said the 12-step program for illiberal populists, and I'm wondering if that's actually a thing, and if that is a thing, where we can find it.
A little under 40.
The 12-step program for destroying democracy can be found in my book, Ill Winds. And I suppose maybe I should have asked myself whether I really wanted to delineate it so conveniently for aspiring autocrats. But they're figuring it out on their own and borrowing from one another. So I doubt that their insights on how to do this are being gleaned from a book whose subtitle begins with Saving Democracy. I don't think we have a scale of civil society, a measurement of civil society robustness and vigor. There have been a couple of, I think, false starts to try and do that, but just imagine the qualitative measurement challenges involved in that. It's a great question. Of course, issues of standardization in measurement enter in, but if anybody knows about such a measurement exercise, I'd love to know about it and use it if it's good. So Andreas, yes, I think that often these autocrats couch what they're doing, and of course populism intrinsically does this, as democratic, as empowering the people. I mean, this is almost the definition of populism, sweeping away old corrupt elites and empowering the people. And probably most of the time there is truth in that, right? There is truth in that. And so many people who support AMLO and his designated successor may indeed believe that and feel that. But what's striking to me, looking at the Latino barometer data, is how few Mexicans these days are even feeling the need to gesture to say that democracy is always the best form of government. That is, the stated conviction that democracy is good and necessary has significantly eroded. And parallel to that, I really have to thank my research assistant for this. He's really pulled together a lot of evidence. And this is not uncommon. The most trusted institution in Mexico is the military, and this is a dangerous thing. I don't say there's going to be a military coup, but it's a dangerous thing. So Hans, I think you have asked a really, really good and interesting question, and and it comes in two parts, so I'm going to answer it in two parts. I think that there are most definitely two different stories of resilience. And then sub-stories within them. Basically, one is a deep story and one is a hanging on by the fingernails story. One is a story of a restoration of a deep liberal equilibrium, and the other is the story of a persisting low-level equilibrium. And I think Greece and maybe Poland, we will look back upon, and I'm sure there will be others, as a deeper resilience, a restoration of and it won't be easy, of a liberal and higher quality resilience, a resilience of the liberal spirit and structure of accountability and institutional restraints. I think Argentina is the hanging on story. It hasn't broken down. This is such an interesting country. One of the biggest puzzles is the persistence of normative support for democracy in Argentina in the face of such manifest successive performance failures and corrupt and criminal conduct on the part of so many of its elected leaders. And one of the things that worries me is that, you know, you can only hang on by your fingernails for so long. It might even be 20 or 30 years, but if you don't kind of start veering toward the deeper form of resilience, it's an accident waiting to happen. And then the distinction you noted is between the institutions that protect democracy and the lack of a need to, by Catherine.
I'm just so
I
disgusted
know-
with the state of democracy.
No, you have to go teach about
I
it.
do have to go teach in a class. Thank you.
Between the institutions that protect democracy and not needing to have recurrent protection of democracy. And that's an interesting way of configuring it. And well, as I think you need both behavioral data and attitudinal or normative data to really get an adequate grasp of what's happening with regard to democracy. And when the two merge in pointing to resilience, resilient commitment to democratic principles and norms, both in their minds and in their behavior, that's when you have democratic health.
Apologies if we didn't get to your question today, but we ran out of time. Larry, thank you for sharing your incredible insights. Surprise, next week we won't be meeting in this room, we'll be meeting downstairs in EOA. Maria Coriel, our postdoc, will be presenting her research on rebel parties and reservations with a focus on Colombia. Come join us, thank you.